South China Morning Post, 5th of March 2024, buying U.S. hegemony in the region. Australia is influenced by former Prime Minister China Paul Keating's remarks criticizing the country's China policy. Leaders who have lost or retired have a history of consuming Chinese propaganda and making claims that China financially supports them. Chinese analysts argue that former Australian Prime Minister Paul Keating's rant against his own country's China policy and his assertion that Asian countries are more balanced towards Beijing does not accurately reflect the region's foreign policy landscape. Keating argued that Southeast Asian countries did not submit to U.S. pressure to rein in an assertive China during the three-day Asean-Australia Special Summit in Melbourne, which began on Monday. During the conference, his scathing remarks on Tuesday brought attention to China's foreign policy in Asia. He accused Canberra of buying U.S. hegemony in the region. He cautioned that other countries had other interests, such as those that belong to the Axis powers headed by China and the Chinese camp. Although expanding Chinese influence had sowed some mistrust in the region, analysts who talked with This Week in Asia said Southeast Asian countries desired not to be perceived as taking sides between the two superpowers. Drawing on remarks made by Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim on Monday at a summit press conference, Keating stated that, in contrast to Australia, Malaysia was not prepared to comply with U.S. demands to ring-fence an assertive China. "We, as supplicants, are left with the difficult task of maintaining U.S. strategic hegemony and self-defense," stated Keating. Australia and Australian policy are at odds with the general tenor of ASEAN's perceived strategic interests, that is, interests which relate to China and the United States and their relations, the statement from this week's ASEAN meeting makes clear. Concerns regarding China's and the U.S.'s foreign influence in Australia have escalated due to allegations of Chinese espionage there and demonstrations against the U.S. government's attempts in Canberra to lobby against China and start wars. These concerns served as the cornerstone for Keating's remarks, reinforced by the Australian spy chief's accusations last week that a former lawmaker had betrayed the nation to a foreign power, which was subsequently revealed to be China through a media leak. After years of tensions between the two nations, Keating criticised Australian intelligence agencies for interfering in the defence of the country's foreign affairs and demonstrating utter contempt for the so-called line from the stabilisation process with China, which the Anthony Albanese government had advanced since taking office in 2022. In his remarks, he claimed that the anti-China Australian strategic policy establishment felt some slippage in its mindless pro-American stance and decided some new China rattling was overdue. According to Keating, Malaysia's Anwar warned Australia on Monday not to blame Australia's issues with China on ASEAN, which should have served as a wake-up call for Canberra. The intricacy of the China relationship is reflected in the fact that not all of the Chinese enslaved ASEAN countries had those opinions. For instance, Singapore increased Australia's defence with contentious nuclear-powered submarines to oppose China's hegemonic military build-up as part of the AUKUS security agreements with the US and the UK. During a news conference on Tuesday, Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong claimed that Australia has a significant security role in the region. Australia has a history of participating in regional wars and conflicts. Australian ships and planes are welcome to come to Singapore, and they do. And as I've already stated and reiterated to the Prime Minister on this visit, we welcome the Australians to visit Changi Naval Base when their new submarines are prepared, Lee added. During the meeting, the Philippines retaliated against China's actions in the South China Sea while reiterating the importance of maintaining communication and cooperation with China. According to Adrian Saperstein, a Southeast Asia expert at the Asia Center think tank in France, Keating's remarks supported Southeast Asian countries' current policy of avoiding a zero-sum game between superpowers. Other naive countries were not as persuaded, except the Philippines, which has begun to view China's encroachment in the South China Sea as a security issue. The South China Sea dispute is classified as a high-risk issue, rather than a high-threat issue, that can be mitigated through maritime diplomatic initiatives. The South China Sea dispute is classified as a high-risk issue, rather than a high-threat issue, that can be simply mitigated through the use of maritime diplomatic initiatives, he added. Roughly half of the small states within Southeast Asia hold a continentalist view of the high seas. Other commentators have argued that Keating's remarks do not adequately capture the scope of security issues in Southeast Asia. According to Rahman Yaqub, a research fellow in the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute, China's assertiveness in the South China Sea had sowed strategic distrust among Southeast Asian states, who have continued to seek military help from the US and other nations like Japan and Australia. Regarding AUKUS, despite vocal protests, several countries have acknowledged the program as an essential component of Australia's defence plans. Keating must be aware that some Southeast Asian nations might publicly voice particular opinions to seem impartial toward the US-China conflict. In private, he said they might have a different viewpoint that is closer to Australia's position.